And what if some consciousnesses simply choose not to return? The question seems to contradict both religious traditions and scientific expectations, but it appears in the margins of a collection that in itself already challenges common sense. The investigations of Ian Stevenson, 1918-2007, a Canadian psychiatrist who dedicated over 40 years to documenting memories of past lives, especially in children. While his best-known studies describe precise recognition of places and people, there are, scattered throughout letters, field notebooks, and private communications, hints of another mental landscape, accounts of a refusal. Not a diffuse panic, but a thoughtful gesture, as if part of the mind in the interval between existences said, "Enough." Stevenson did not publish a treatise on this. His methodological prudence kept him faithful to what could be replicated and tested. Even so, within the climate-controlled archives of the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, notes emerge alluding to reluctant souls, an expression he used in private correspondence in the 1970s. In these notes, the researcher records moments when, during supervised regressions, the subject reaches what many call the transition and hesitates. Sometimes the reason is a serene fatigue. At other times, the fear of forgetting who they were. The difficulty for science begins there. How to measure the will of a consciousness when it describes a state where time does not operate as we know it? In West Germany, where therapists and hypnotists followed protocols inspired by Stevenson in the 1980s, this layer of the phenomenon gained local contour. Discrete practices in cities like Freiburg, Bonn, and Munich became observation points for in-between lives memories. In small meetings, far from academic fanfare, professionals described patients who, when narrating the passage, interrupted themselves before a luminous line, as if crossing implied not just being born again, but giving up one's self. "I don't want to forget," a patient from Berlin allegedly said, according to a report forwarded to Charlottesville. The style of the descriptions was noteworthy. They were clear statements without stridency, noted with the same sobriety that characterized all of Stevenson's work. For the German public, pragmatic, accustomed to rigorous ethical debates, attentive to the distinction between belief and evidence, this hypothesis raises a concrete question. If the continuity of consciousness is possible, can the refusal be as well? Stevenson did not answer with doctrine. He preferred to register patterns, compare cultures, and weigh coincidences. His notebooks, yellowed with age, show a scientist committed to separating conviction from observation, yet sensitive to what repeatedly came back to the table: the desire not to return. This documentary follows this parallel track, where the cautious investigator meets voices asking for rest. We will delve into letters, dated notes, and testimonies preserved on tapes, materials produced during Stevenson's life between 1918 and 2007, to reconstruct, with the greatest possible rigor, the history of a subject that almost never made headlines. We do not seek to prove a dogma, but to understand a human pattern reported in different languages and contexts. In the end, perhaps the question will have shifted. The mystery might not just be how we return, but whether and why some consciously choose not to come back. In the silent corridors of the University of Virginia, among metal shelves and boxes labeled with almost indecipherable codes, rest the records that Ian Stevenson accumulated over 4 decades of research. These are more than 2,500 investigations of alleged reincarnation cases, conducted in countries as distinct as India, Lebanon, Turkey, and Germany. Amidst meticulous reports, photographs, and transcriptions, there is a discreet, ordinary-looking box marked only with the number 42B. When the cataloging team opened the contents, years after the researcher's death, they found something unusual: small notebooks dated between 1971 and 1992. In them, Stevenson had recorded what he called anomalies of the return cycle, observations that did not fit the classic pattern of children's memories of past lives. The notes were brief, handwritten with hurried calligraphy, often interrupted by ellipses. In one of them, it read, "Subject reports permanence between lives exceeding a terrestrial century. Expresses fear of physical pain. Explicit refusal of new incarnation." These records were never transformed into scientific articles. Stevenson seemed to consider that they belonged to a different sphere, not empirical proof, but philosophical reflection. Still, he preserved them rigorously, like someone guarding an incomplete piece of a puzzle that might one day be understood. Among the yellowed pages, references to Germany emerge, a country with which Stevenson maintained intense correspondence during the 1980s. One of his interlocutors was the Hamburg psychologist Dieter Haller, known for applying memory regressions for therapeutic purposes. In a letter dated 1985, Haller described patients who, upon reaching what they called the plane of light, simply refused to advance. "It is not fear," the German wrote. "It is a sense of existential saturation." Stevenson's reply, now archived in the same set of documents, is brief but revealing. Perhaps the cycle is not compulsory as we assume. Maybe there are degrees of freedom that the human mind has not yet conceived. It was an unusual statement for a scientist of such a cautious profile. Instead of concluding the matter, he left it open, like someone acknowledging that not all phenomena fit within the limits of verification. Other fragments follow the same line. In a 1990 note sent to a French colleague, Stevenson writes, "There are consciousnesses that recoil from life like someone who has completed a circle. There is no fear, only the serenity of nothing more remaining to experience." These papers, still little explored, reveal a more contemplative facet of the researcher. Not the man of statistics and field interviews, but the silent observer who perceives the outline of the ineffable. Among his notes, there are no signs of aggressive skepticism or declared faith, only the honesty of someone who looks at the unknown and admits, "There is something I do not understand, but which deserves to be recorded." Today, when one leafs through these pages in Charlottesville, the impression is of hearing a murmur that spans decades, voices that do not want to return, memories that stop at the border of being. A mosaic of consciousnesses that by refusing return seem to teach that even eternity can tire. In Ian Stevenson's studies, a recurring concept was intermission memories, memories of the interval between lives. He described them as accounts where consciousness recalled fragments of the time that stretched between death and rebirth. In many cases, children claim to have waited in a space of light, observing, listening to voices, or simply existing in a state of expectation. For Stevenson, these memories offered clues about the continuity of the mind beyond the physical biography, but what he rarely commented on publicly was the intriguing variation. Not all souls wish to leave that state. During an interview in 1981, Stevenson mentioned that about 20% of the studied cases included some kind of memory of this intermediate period. Most described brief passages, moments of transition, preparation, and choice. However, there were notable exceptions. A 6-year-old girl from Sri Lanka reported that she waited a long time, but then didn't want to come back. She said she was asked to choose a new body, but she closed her eyes and the wind pushed. The episode was documented in reports now preserved at the University of Virginia. What most intrigued the researcher was the sense of choice. He avoided religious interpretations, but acknowledged that the structure of the narratives was similar across different cultures. There was a call, a boundary, and sometimes a refusal. In societies like Indian or Burmese, where reincarnation is part of the cosmology, return was seen as natural and desirable. In more secular contexts, such as Germany and Canada, however, a new pattern emerged, that of silent resistance. In the 1980s, German therapists began adapting the regression techniques described by Stevenson. In practices in Berlin and Munich, the accounts were repeated with local nuances. A woman identified as Claudia R. under light hypnosis described a bright line separating two spaces. "On the other side is the cold," she said. "If I cross, I will forget everything. I don't want to forget." For Stevenson, this type of statement represented a crucial point. The fear was not of death, but of the loss of identity. In his 1985 notes, he wrote, "Resistance to reincarnation seems associated with the fear of forgetting. It is not a denial of existence, but of the dissolution of the self." This observation touched the core of his investigation. If consciousness survives, but each new birth implies erasing the previous memory, what truly continues? Is the soul an essence, or merely the memory of itself? By comparing cases from Asia and Europe, Stevenson identified a cultural trend. The more individualistic the worldview, the greater the refusal to return. Where life is viewed as a unique experience, he noted, the spirit resists repetition. These conclusions, although not formally published, pointed to a philosophical dimension that went beyond experimental psychology. Perhaps what the so-called reluctant souls expressed was not despair, but exhaustion, a spiritual depletion that does not wish to restart learning, but rather to rest in the understanding already achieved. On this frontier, where the impulse to live balances with the desire to cease, Stevenson encountered one of the most delicate questions of his career. What if the true mystery of consciousness is not the restart, but the instant it decides to stop? Between the 1970s and 1990s, as Ian Stevenson gathered hundreds of reports on past life memories, he began to notice a pattern that troubled him. In certain cases, the memory seemed not to manifest completely. The subject did not recognize locations or names, but exhibited behaviors and sensations that suggested a kind of spiritual misalignment. Stevenson called these episodes silent resistance, situations where consciousness seemed to pause between two planes. The reports coming from Germany particularly caught his attention. In Bonn, a doctor named Kurt Weigel sent Stevenson the case of a 7-year-old boy who, for no apparent medical reason, refused to speak. During a supervised hypnotherapy session, the boy stammered only one phrase. "They ask me to come down, but I want to stay." The record, dated 1982, was briefly mentioned by Stevenson at a restricted conference at the University of Freiburg. Shortly after, a similar case arrived from Hanover. A woman identified as Anka, subjected to a therapeutic session, reported feeling a call I was not answering. Under light hypnosis, she described a corridor of light and insistent voices, but added, "I don't want to be anyone again." The perplexed therapist sent the session tape to Stevenson, who archived it in Charlottesville. These testimonies, though brief, shared the same tone. The refusal was not accompanied by anguish or disturbance. It was a calm, almost rational denial, expressed with lucidity. In his notebooks, Stevenson wrote, "Some subjects report a state of conscious wakefulness between lives. The refusal of reincarnation seems, in certain cases, a thoughtful decision, not an emotional reaction." And he completed with a question that would permeate his reflections until the end of his life. What happens when the soul chooses not to choose? From then on, debates among his colleagues in Germany intensified. Some, with strictly medical training, saw these accounts merely as metaphors of the unconscious, symbolic projections of the fear of death or psychological exhaustion. Others, more open to parapsychology, suggested that it was an advanced stage of consciousness, in which the spirit no longer needed material experience. Stevenson, as usual, remained between the extremes. He refused theological interpretations, but also did not dismiss the existential value of the testimonies. Neutrality, he would say, is what allows the researcher to see the invisible. For him, these voices were not asking for explanations. They were asking to be heard. The most notable thing about the accounts of reluctant souls is the absence of drama. There is no tragedy, no clamor for salvation, only the serenity of someone who contemplates their own journey and decides that they no longer need to continue. This quietude moved the scientist, who noted, perhaps rest is also a form of wisdom. In Stevenson's archives, these pages occupy a minimal space in volume, but an immense space in significance. They are fragments of a philosophy that the researcher never dared to formulate publicly. The idea that, even in the face of eternity, there can be a right to repose. As the years advanced, Ian Stevenson began to observe that, in cases where reincarnation was refused, the same feeling emerged with persistence: fatigue. Not physical exhaustion, but a kind of exhaustion of existence itself. People in regression described a lucid rest, a timeless interval, where there was neither pain nor desire. The most surprising thing is that they spoke of it with serenity. There was no fear, only the feeling that everything there was to learn had already been learned. In 1988, during a restricted conference in Tübingen, Stevenson presented excerpts from testimonies collected in Germany and Canada. One of them said, "It's not that I don't want to live, it's that the stories repeat themselves, only the faces change." Another recorded, "Return brings no hope, only continuity." The phrases were noted in notebooks today, catalogued under the code TS88-3, and they impressed those present with their clear and articulated tone, far from any hysteria. These accounts not only challenged scientific understanding, but also touched a philosophical dilemma. If consciousness survives death and maintains memories, what does it mean to desire the end of one's own continuity? And if this will is, in itself, a form of evolution? Stevenson then began to note parallels between these testimonies and the Buddhist notion of parinirvana, the state in which the soul, having concluded its learning, ceases the cycle of rebirths. Still, he refused to frame them within any doctrine. For him, the value of these cases lay in their constancy, not in belief. In a 1991 note, the researcher wrote, "Tired consciousnesses do not express fear, but lucidity. They do not reject life, they understand it." This lucidity seemed to mark a boundary where continuity ceased to be compulsion and became a choice. In Munich, therapists began to discuss the topic from a new ethical perspective. If the soul can refuse return, is it claiming the right to conclude the journey? Is there such a thing as a right to spiritual forgetting? The question sounded provocative. In cultures that value infinite spiritual progress, the idea of a voluntary end was almost heresy. However, Stevenson preferred to see in it not a denial, but a maturation. Listening is more important than interpreting, he would tell colleagues. One of the most impactful records in his collection describes the account of an Austrian man who, under hypnosis, claimed to be before a gray field where time sleeps. When the therapist asked what he expected there, he calmly replied, "Nothing. Nothingness is enough for me." Stevenson made no comment, only noted it down, perhaps realizing that, in that silence, there was something no theory could explain. These accounts did not speak of escape, but of completeness. The fatigue of the souls Stevenson studied was not giving up, but a tranquil recognition that the cycle may have come to an end. And it is in this disconcerting serenity that the researcher seemed to find a new form of wisdom, that even eternity sometimes needs rest. When Ian Stevenson passed away in 2007, at the age of 88, part of his archives remained unpublished. Among reports, recordings, and personal notes, there was a group of documents that would never be published, not for lack of scientific rigor, but for touching on a territory too delicate, where method was confused with meditation. In them, Stevenson referred to a set of cases as quiet souls. These notes were written between the late 1990s and the early 2000s, a period when the researcher was already moving away from fieldwork but maintained constant correspondence with therapists in Europe. In a letter from 2004 addressed to a colleague in Heidelberg, Stevenson wrote, "Some consciousnesses seem to pause in a state of continuous observation. They no longer participate, they only contemplate. Perhaps this is the true rest." The words sound more confessional than academic. After decades pursuing proof of the soul's continuity, the scientist seemed finally to lean towards accepting silence as an answer. He did not speak of refusal, but of completeness, the feeling that the cycle closes naturally, without rupture or pain. The reports coming from Germany during this period reinforced this impression. In 1998, the psychotherapist Josef Meltzer from Frankfurt recorded the case of a woman who, under hypnosis, described a white space without direction. She said, "There are voices calling me, but I don't want to answer. I've been many times. I no longer have a name." In the same year, in Bavaria, a 23-year-old man reported having remained like a breeze without a body for an indefinite time. When the therapist asked why he did not wish to be reborn, he replied, "Because every return is a farewell, and I've already said too many goodbyes." These testimonies reached Charlottesville shortly before Stevenson's retirement and were catalogued by his assistants as cases of serene refusal. What was noteworthy was not the supernatural content, but the emotional tone. None exhibited fear, despair, or regret. In all of them, there was a peace that merged with lucidity, a type of consciousness that seemed to have reached the limit of its own learning. In the debates that followed, German scholars raised divergent hypotheses. Some suggested that these descriptions reflected a process of total personality integration, a state where nothing more remains to be projected onto matter. Others saw in it metaphors of the collective unconscious, symbolic expressions of the desire for rest. Stevenson, even on the brink of retirement, remained faithful to the stance that always characterized him. Neither deny nor affirm, just record. In one of his last notes, he wrote, "If the refusal is symbolic, it is a universal symbol, and universal symbols deserve to be heard." Today, rereading these fragments, the impression is that Stevenson had arrived at a more human understanding of the phenomenon he studied throughout his life. The quiet souls he described were not asking for proof or redemption, just the right to remain motionless in time. Because perhaps rest is not the opposite of life, but its deepest realization. In the final years of active research between 1999 and 2005, Ian Stevenson began to register a subtle change in his own way of thinking. After decades gathering evidence of the continuity of consciousness, he became interested in the gaps, the silences, the absences, the points where memory seemed voluntarily interrupted. In one of his notebooks from 2003, he wrote a phrase that would mark this turning point. "Perhaps forgetting is not a failure of the soul, but a right earned." The observation, simple and profound, summarized a philosophical shift in his work. Stevenson seemed to recognize that the value of experience was not just in its repetition, but also in the possibility of ceasing. Continuity, viewed for years as evidence of survival, also became a possible burden, and forgetting, previously understood as a limitation, began to be interpreted as a choice. In Germany, psychologist Sabine Kroll, a collaborator of the researcher, developed a study in 2001 applying light regression to patients who claimed to feel incomplete memories. Many reported brief images followed by an absolute void. When questioned, they responded similarly, "It's not that I don't remember, it's that I don't want to." Kroll called this phenomenon Recht auf geistige Ruhe, the right to rest of the mind. Stevenson followed the study from afar, exchanging letters with the therapist. In one of them, he wrote, "There are souls that have completed the curve of learning. For them, remembering is reopening a healed wound." This idea, though never officially published, modified the very concept of reincarnation. the cycle ceased to be an obligation of nature to become a voluntary possibility, and, like every choice, it included the right not to proceed. Among the more skeptical colleagues, this hypothesis caused discomfort. Suggesting that the soul could decide to stop sounded heretical to both science and religion. However, among philosophers and scholars of the German tradition, the notion seemed to echo an ancient concept present in Goethe and Schopenhauer: Wille zur Ruhe, the will to rest. It is not a desire for annihilation, but to reach a point of conscious stillness, the end of the essential restlessness that drives existence. Stevenson, a careful reader of philosophy, noted in 1999, "Perhaps the soul does not fear forgetting, perhaps it desires it." It was a short sentence, but one that synthesized an entire trajectory. In 2005, during one of his last public conferences, he concluded the lecture with an observation few would forget: "If there is freedom in life, there must be freedom between lives as well." These words provoked silence among those present. For many, they sounded almost like an intellectual farewell, the confession that, at the end of decades of searching, Stevenson understood that the soul, like knowledge itself, needs to know when to rest. Perhaps, one of his German disciples concluded years later, the researcher finally realized that proving reincarnation was not his true objective. What he was truly seeking to understand was the freedom of consciousness, including the freedom not to continue. When Ian Stevenson's personal archives were organized after his death in 2007, one of the assistants found a sealed envelope stored between notebooks and cassette tapes. On the cover, in small, almost shy letters, it read, "For whoever listens." Inside were 5 typed pages, without a precise date, without a title. The text did not follow the format of a scientific report. It was a testimony, perhaps a vent. Right on the first line, Stevenson noted, "The phenomenon of reluctant souls should not be interpreted as a failure or disorder. It may be the purest form of consciousness, the one that no longer needs to repeat because it has understood the cycle." He described experiences where, under hypnosis, patients said they saw no tunnel, no light, no command. There is only the being that observes, satisfied by wanting nothing. These pages summarize, in a few lines, what was perhaps the final destination of his search. Not to prove reincarnation, but to understand the silence that surrounds it. Stevenson, the cautious doctor, the patient empiricist, seemed finally to admit that there was wisdom in fatigue, lucidity in the pause. On one of the sheets, he recalls a session held in Freiburg in the late 1980s. A patient asked him, "What if the learning ends, Professor? What comes after?" He merely replied, "Then perhaps rest comes." That word, rest, repeats throughout the pages, not as a metaphor for death, but as a state of comprehension. "Rest," he wrote, "is the instant the self dissolves, not in loss, but in understanding." In the following years, German scholars who revisited the material realized something essential. The refusal of reincarnation in these accounts did not express denial, but spiritual maturity, a cycle not broken, but concluded. The soul that decides to remain does not run from life. It merely recognizes that it has lived enough. Among the archives, there was also a tape recording, dated 1989, from a therapist in Bremen. The feminine voice, identified only as Clara M., calmly said, "They call me to come back, but I am already everything I have been. There is nothing left to add. If I stay, I stay. If they make me come back, I will forget, and everything will start again." Then, the sound of a deep breath, followed by silence. No comment from Stevenson, no analysis. Only the raw record of a soul that chose to stop. Perhaps this is the true legacy of the researcher, to show that not all absence is a mystery to be solved. Some are just the repose of those who have understood enough. Stevenson seemed to sense this when he wrote, in his last known note, "There are those who see death as the end. I see it as a pause, the interval between two silences." The case of the souls who refuse to reincarnate belongs not to the domain of belief or proof, but to that of listening, because, fundamentally, it speaks of something profoundly human, the instant when even eternity bows before the will to rest. And so, in the lines of his yellowed notebooks, Ian Stevenson left perhaps his most discreet and most beautiful conclusion, that there are lives that want to return, and there are consciousnesses that have already learned to remain quiet. It is in this silence, human, serene, and infinite, that the last secret of the soul may be hidden.